In early 1945, Captain Aaron Bank entered the London headquarters of the OSS at number 70 Grosvenor Street, Mayfair. The OSS was the Office of Strategic Services, the U.S. government's wartime spy service that had the responsibility of both gathering intelligence and conducting special operations. Bank was a member of the SO, or Special Operations Branch of the OSS, and he was reporting for a new mission, one that could potentially shorten the war in Europe. Bank was briefed by Gerald E. Miller, the OSS chief of SO in London. Allied intelligence indicated that the Germans had long planned to consolidate in a redoubt in the Alps. It was reported that top Nazi leaders planned to retreat there along with SS troops to make their final stand. The OSS plan was to create a top-secret unit of carefully selected anti-Nazi German POWs, train them in unconventional warfare, then drop them into the redoubt wearing German uniforms and carrying German weapons, where they would both establish roadblocks acting as normal German troops and kidnap any high-ranking Nazi officers they found. Then at night, conduct undercover sabotage operations in the area to reduce the effectiveness of German resistance in the redoubt. This Alpine fortress had been planned by Heinrich Himmler back in late 1943 and originally envisioned an area from southern Bavaria across western Austria to northern Italy. Hitler had his famous Berghof vacation retreat in Obersalzberg above the town of Berchtesgaden, near the Austrian border, guarded by troops from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. In fact, many high-ranking Nazis such as Hermann Göring, Martin Bormann, and Albert Speer owned homes in Obersalzberg. Captain Bank was picked for this mission because he was fluent in German and had successfully led a 3-man Jedburgh team, parachuting behind enemy lines into the occupied Lozère department in preparation for Operation Dragoon, the amphibious invasion of southern France. The mission was designated Operation Cross and would come under the direct command and supervision of Lieutenant Colonel Powell, the Paris SO chief. Captain Bank would have full control over both vetting and selecting German POW personnel for the mission and conducting all training. It would be the biggest SO unit of the war. It would also be the OSS's biggest blind drop, meaning there would be no reception committee on the drop zone. Captain Bank accepted the mission without reservation. One note here, in Captain Bank's book he wrote that it was called Operation Iron Cross, but OSS documents only identify it as Operation Cross. In Paris, at the OSS headquarters on the Champs-Élysées, Captain Bank met with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Powell. There he learned that it was Colonel Powell and Captain Robert Lacoste who had come up with the original idea and submitted it to London for approval. The recruiting team that would interview former German soldiers and German dissidents consisted of Bank, Lacoste, Second Lieutenant Hans Marchand, and an OSS civilian named Douglas Bagier. But first, Lacoste had them meet with the leader of a German dissident group, which included members that had previously fled to France and joined the resistance. Many of them had already been recruited by the OSS and were in a compound in Saint-Germain on the outskirts of Paris. The French name of this dissident organization was Comité Allemagne Libre pour l'Ouest, and it was the French version of the Committee of Free Germany for the West, and the KFDW were one of the accepted members of the French resistance. This dissident leader was Karl, a quiet, heavily built 60-year-old who had lost an arm fighting for the Loyalists in the Spanish Civil War. Karl had lists of prospective recruits currently held in French POW camps scattered across the country. Karl also introduced the team to Max and Hermann, who Bank privately described as the assassin and the con man. Max was a muscular former circus strongman, and Hermann was a slick, smooth talker and a former compatriot of Karl's in Spain, where both had fought against Francisco Franco. Max and Hermann's greatest desire was to work as a team in any intelligence capacity. With orders from the French War Ministry in hand, Bank, Lacoste, Marchand, Bagier, and Carl traveled the countryside visiting French POW camps housing German prisoners of war. They visited numerous camps in Cluny, Dijon, Lyon, Marseille, Montpellier, and Carcassonne, where, with the permission of the French camp commander, they would set up a table and interview the men on Carl's list, evaluating each man without disclosing the purpose of the interview. They evaluated the men on their attitude, military background, appearance, bearing, and most important, their opinion of Hitler and if they'd be willing to fight the Nazis. From these interviews, they selected 125 candidates from the German POWs and 45 German civilians from the holding compound at Saint-Germain. And all of these German civilians they selected had fought in the French resistance. That gave them a starting total of 170 candidates. The training site was a French manor house and its grounds in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, about 15 miles west of Paris. The manor house was next to the forest of Saint-Germain that would also be used for training. Local French police were informed of the secret training, though Bank knew that eventually the locals would start figuring things out. The entire operation was a gamble, trying to keep secret the fact that you were training nearly 200 Germans, not to mention the fact that most of them were actual German soldiers captured as prisoners of war. Operational security was always going to be difficult, but the potential payoff was high for what these troops might accomplish in Germany proper. OSS Lieutenant Steve Rogers was in charge of all U.S. support personnel to include kitchen and supply. All the OSS personnel were billeted in the manor house. The Germans lived in tents and had a mess tent and a day room. The mess hall fed both the Americans and the Germans, and S4 Supply kept them all outfitted with the gear they would need. The classrooms were in the manor house. Captain Banks' OSS training team consisted of Lieutenant James Lewis, Master Sergeant Ted Baumgold, Staff Sergeant Popovich, and Sergeant John Goldbeck. Bank briefed his team on their mission to conduct ambushes, raids, destroy lines of communications, commit sabotage, gather intelligence, induce subversion, and generally harass the enemy and capture high-ranking Nazi leaders. The one thing Bank kept secret was where exactly in the Third Reich they would parachute. The unit would portray an elite mountain infantry or Gebirgsjäger company wearing German uniforms with German weapons, gear, and demolitions. During training, Banks' team continuously evaluated each candidate based on ability and attitude. All of them knew that not only was there a danger from these troops during training, what we would today call a green-on-blue incident, but that this danger would increase exponentially once they dropped behind enemy lines. Then there was the possibility of being summarily executed by real German troops if they were captured in uniform. They also knew that a significant portion of their Germans were communists, but Bank adopted General Donovan's motto, "If they kill Nazis, we'll use them." Captain Bank and Lieutenant Lewis created the POI for this training, which included map reading, land navigation, weapons training, individual movement techniques, patrol formations, day and night equipment marches, survival, raids, house clearing, demolitions, sentry elimination, guerrilla warfare, and covert activities. Captain Bank planned 8 to 10 weeks to complete the training. The Germans would be organized into training platoons with all of the German civilians placed in the same platoon, as they would need a slower pace as they did not have the military background as the others. Max and Hermann were included in this group. While marching to training sites, the platoons would be led by rotating German soldiers in each platoon, with 4 Americans on the team falling in as privates and Bank falling in as a Gefreiter or corporal. 1 American for each platoon as the true platoon leaders. Bank also made sure Lieutenant Rogers understood that the cooks were to prepare the best food possible for the German soldiers, to include seconds at every meal. The first arrivals were the German civilians from the internment camp nearby, followed by the former soldiers that had been held in camps all over France. Once all had arrived, they stood at informal attention in front of the manor house while Captain Bank introduced himself. "I am Captain Bank, your commander. I greet you as a member of a unit that will work to train and fight as a team against the Nazis who have enslaved your country and are destroying it. At the same time, they are daily committing crimes against all of Europe and wherever else they have violated international law. By aiding the cause of the Allies, which is your declared intent, you will share in the Allies' noble struggle and undertaking. You will be treated as soldiers, not as prisoners. There are no guards here because I have full faith in each and every one of you. The training will be specialized, rugged, and demanding, but you won't be required to do anything I or my staff won't or can't do. Pay strict attention to your instructors. The better you absorb your training, the more you'll accomplish in the combat phase." There were only 2 questions from the Germans when he was done. "Will we get paid?" "Yes, $5 a day." "Can we go into town?" "No, for security," as the entire mission was classified. Before he dismissed them, Captain Bank emphasized, "This will not be a picnic. At times you will wish you were back in a POW camp rather than suffer this grueling schedule. If you want to drop out now, raise your hand, and you will be returned to the safe monotony from which we sprang you." Not a single candidate raised his hand, and the training began. For the most part, the Germans did well, and though the veterans of the Wehrmacht hit the ground running, they did not necessarily like American-style PT, which included 4 to 5 mile morning runs, complaining it was never so difficult in the Wehrmacht. The German non-vets were in the platoon run by Lieutenant Lewis, as many of them spoke French, as did Lewis. Their PT started out slower and was gradually brought up to speed. After a few weeks of training and evaluations, Bank selected 5 Germans as permanent company leadership. 4 would act as Feldwebel, sergeant, as platoon leaders while marching to training, while the 5th, Kurt, would act as Oberleutnant, first lieutenant, for the entire company. These 5 men would receive additional leadership classes on Sundays, their one day off from training. Sundays was also the day that Bank would do classroom training with Max and Hermann, who were being taught intelligence gathering techniques to include establishing intelligence networks, safe houses, and dead letter drops. These 2 men were going to be dropped in under a separate cover. Instead of in uniform, they would jump in civilian clothes because they were to act as Gestapo officers, complete with forged documentation. The 5 OSS officers who would jump with the Germans also received cover stories that would explain their weaker German accents, and even in the case of Lieutenant Lewis, no German whatsoever. Bank's cover, for example, had him as Henri Marchand, a Nazi sympathizer from Martinique, as his French was better than his German. His papers included his French carte d'identité and his German Army Soldbuch. The OSS Censorship and Documents Branch produced similar documentation for every German soldier in the unit. Though the drop zone had yet to be designated, the unit went through airborne training, through aircraft mock-ups for door exits, platforms for parachute landing falls, and parachute harness hanging device for canopy control. The initial plan was to do 2 drops over 2 nights, 2 platoons each night. If the drop zone was particularly difficult, a 4-man team consisting of Captain Bank, Max, Hermann, and one of the American radio operators would be dropped in first as pathfinders. This team would ensure they were at the correct drop zone, then radio in for further drops, setting up lights and/or panels to mark the drop zone for the aircraft. Getting the soldiers' actual practice jumps was difficult but not critical. It was not unusual for OSS agents to do their very first jump into combat. Lieutenant Marchand set up a screening procedure to identify security risks with the help of an OSS psychiatrist, but everyone realized that it could never be 100%. By March of 1945, after weeks of training, about 25 of the candidates were dropped from the program. None were considered security risks, but rather they just physically or mentally didn't make the cut. some of the remaining Germans complained about losing their comrades, and Bank explained they didn't meet the standards, and as such risked the lives of every man in their platoon. The grumbling stopped. There were bed checks every night, and by now there would be a couple empty, but Bank and his men found them at the local brothels every time. Bank talked with Max and Herman, the biggest offenders, and they were reassured that none of these Germans would ever desert because American rations were so good. They especially loved the ice cream and apple pie topped with whipped cream. One thing the Germans admitted to missing was German beer, and who could blame them? The German troops were becoming especially tough, and their training included hand-to-hand fighting in the OSS judo style influenced by the legendary William E. Fairbairn. The German skill in this ability was put to the test one night when a number of French Moroccan Goumier soldiers snuck into camp to see what they could steal. These famed knife fighters got their asses handed to them in a fracas that woke the entire camp. Max was in the middle of it, throwing bodies left and right. A couple of the Moroccan fighting knives were left behind in their retreat, and a few Moroccans went to the hospital in ambulances. The Germans, however, had only a few superficial cuts. The French military police filed no official reports, as the entire outfit was classified. In the middle of April, Captain Bank received a visit from Bob Lacoste and Colonel Powell, who informed him that Wild Bill Donovan, the director of the OSS, had quizzed them on Operation Cross and its commander, Captain Bank. When Powell and Lacoste assured Donovan of Bank's and the unit's capabilities, Donovan wanted the mission expanded. Donovan wanted Cross to get Hitler. The drop zone was finally identified and was located above the Inn Valley, in the vicinity of Schwaz, Austria, at an altitude of about 4,500 feet. It wasn't great, but it was the most acceptable. Captain Bank planned to lead it in with a four-man Pathfinder team consisting of himself, Max, Herman, and Sergeant Goldbeck as a replacement for Master Sergeant Baumgold, who had sprained his ankle. Goldbeck and Bank would jump in U.S. uniforms, while Max and Herman would jump in their British-made, German-styled civvies, carrying their Gestapo identity papers and ration books. They would also jump with equipment bundles that had their radio and German uniforms for Bank and Goldbeck. But first, Captain Bank had to go and brief 7th Army, for they were the troops that would be advancing into the redoubt area Operation Cross would operate in, and the risk was high for a friendly fire incident when they made contact, as everyone on the Cross mission would be wearing German uniforms, carrying German weapons, and speaking German. Bank met with the 7th Army leadership, and they came up with paroles and signals for link-up. In April 1945, Bank, Goldbeck, Max, and Herman were put into isolation in Dijon to prepare for the jump. The plan was that Lieutenant Lewis and the rest of the Cross Company would be jumping in on receiving Bank's orders from the drop zone, as relayed through Captain Lacoste. The night jump was delayed one day due to bad weather, and Bank told Lacoste they would risk a daylight jump, weather permitting. It was canceled the second night for the same reason. In fact, bad weather canceled the jump for 6 nights in a row, and by then, 7th Army broke through into the western end of the Inn Valley in Austria. Then came the call from London. Operation Cross was canceled. Years later, Aaron Bank learned that it might have been the State Department that had canceled the mission, as they were wary of dropping potential communist sympathizers into Austria. I have my doubts about that, as though the State Department might be able to influence, they had no authority to cancel. There were 2 overriding reasons that made much more sense. First was the risk of a catastrophic friendly fire incident when the 7th Army met the Cross Company. But more important was the fact there was no Alpenfestung. Heinrich Himmler's Alpine fortress was a pipe dream. Hitler had never approved it and was too busy moving imaginary chess pieces around maps of an ever-shrinking Germany deep in his bunker in Berlin. Few German troops gathered there for a last-ditch defense, and 7th Army easily dealt with them. There was little chance for Cross to capture high-level Nazis and 0 chance to get Hitler, as he never left Berlin. As for Max, Hermann, and the rest of the Operation Cross Germans, sadly, they were returned to their POW or internment camps with recommendations for early release. What happened to them after remains unknown, though there is a good chance that a few were used for much smaller missions into Germany to collect intelligence before the war ended, as the OSS did conduct such operations. Because of French support for the entire operation, it is likely that they were indeed released early and returned home to help rebuild Germany, though I would bet some members of the German civilian platoon remained in France. I would also not be surprised to learn that more than a few of the German soldiers emigrated to the United States. German soldiers have been doing that since the Revolutionary War.